The Republican Strategy Committee meeting was supposed to be routine. It was a cold February morning in Washington, D.C., and the ornate conference room in the Capitol building was filled with the party's most influential voices. The mahogany table reflected the harsh fluorescent lights as members filed in, their faces showing the weight of recent electoral defeats and internal party conflicts that had been brewing for months. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary strategy meeting. Word had spread through the Capitol's corridors that Liz Cheney had specifically requested this gathering, and everyone understood what that meant. This was about reasserting control. This was about putting the so-called radicals in their place. This was about determining the future direction of the Republican Party. Liz Cheney sat at the head of the table, her posture rigid and commanding, her eyes scanning the room with the confidence of someone who had never truly faced consequences for her actions. She wore an expensive navy suit that screamed Washington establishment, her perfectly styled hair and designer accessories sending a clear message about who belonged in these halls of power. She had called this meeting, ostensibly to discuss the party's messaging strategy moving forward. But everyone in that room knew the real agenda. Lauren Boebert entered the room with her characteristic energy, her boots clicking against the marble floor with purpose. She wore a simple black blazer over a white blouse, no pretense, no designer labels, no attempt to impress the Washington elite. Just the authentic presence of someone who had actually worked for a living before entering politics. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical style, and her demeanor radiated the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and where you come from. She took her seat near the middle of the table, directly across from Cheney, and the positioning felt symbolic. Here were two women who represented everything the Republican Party was fighting about internally. Cheney represented the establishment, the old guard, the Washington insider, who had turned her back on Trump and, many argued, on the voters who had elected her. Boebert represented the grassroots, the newcomer, the unapologetic conservative who had risen from restaurant owner to congresswoman on the strength of her convictions and her willingness to fight for ordinary Americans. The other committee members filed in, sensing the brewing confrontation. Jim Jordan took his usual seat, his tie slightly askew as always, his demeanor suggesting he knew exactly what was about to unfold. Matt Gaetz entered with his characteristic swagger, followed by several other members who represented various factions within the party. The establishment Republicans sat closer to Cheney, while those aligned with the Trump wing of the party positioned themselves nearer to Boebert. Cheney began the meeting with her typical condescending tone, the kind of voice that had made her so many enemies within her own party. "Ladies and gentlemen, we need to discuss the direction of our party," she said, her voice carrying that familiar note of superiority that had grated on Wyoming voters for years. "We've allowed certain elements to damage our brand. We need to return to principled conservatism, to the values that made the Republican Party great." She paused dramatically, letting her words sink in, her gaze sweeping across the room before settling on Boebert. The implication was clear to everyone present. When Cheney talked about certain elements, she wasn't being subtle about who she meant. "The American people are tired of the chaos," Cheney continued, her voice becoming more pointed. "They want leaders who understand governance, who have experience, who can actually get things done in Washington. They want representatives who understand the complexities of foreign policy, who can navigate the intricacies of legislation, who can work across the aisle to find solutions. Not performance artists who prioritize social media attention over serious policy work." The room fell silent, the tension ratcheting up another notch. Boebert's jaw tightened slightly, but she remained calm, her hands folded on the table. She had been expecting this confrontation for months. She had been preparing for this moment ever since Cheney had started her campaign against Trump supporters within the party, ever since Cheney had begun her media tour designed to rehabilitate her image at the expense of her Republican colleagues. But Cheney wasn't finished. She was just getting started, and she was about to make a fatal miscalculation. She leaned forward, her voice becoming sharper, more personal. "We need to ask ourselves some hard questions about representation. Are we really going to let people without proper educational credentials, without any real experience in government, continue to embarrass our party on the national stage? Are we going to continue to allow populist rhetoric to overshadow serious policy discussions? The attack was becoming more personal by the moment, and several members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't policy disagreement anymore. This was character assassination, and it was about to backfire spectacularly. I mean, let's be honest about what we're dealing with here, Cheney continued, her voice dripping with disdain. We have members of our own party who seem to think that running a restaurant qualifies them to make decisions about national security. We have people who believe that social media followers are more important than legislative experience. We have individuals who think that stirring up controversy is the same thing as governing. That's when Cheney made her fatal mistake. She looked directly at Boebert, her eyes cold and calculating, and delivered what she thought would be the killing blow. The room held its collective breath as she prepared to cross a line that would change everything. "Lauren," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "I have to ask, and I think I speak for many of us here when I say this, what exactly qualifies someone with a GED to be making decisions about national security? About foreign policy? About complex economic issues that affect millions of Americans? What business does someone with your limited educational background have in the halls of Congress, making decisions that affect the future of our nation?" The room went completely silent. You could hear the air conditioning humming, the distant sound of traffic outside, the shuffle of papers as members tried to process what they had just witnessed. Several members looked genuinely shocked at the personal nature of the attack. This wasn't policy disagreement anymore. This was class warfare, and Cheney had just fired the first shot in what would become a massacre. Boebert sat perfectly still for a moment, her hands still folded on the table, her expression unreadable. When she finally looked up, there was something different in her eyes. Not anger, not hurt, but something far more powerful. Clarity, purpose, the kind of steely determination that comes from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to be ashamed of it. "Liz," she said, her voice calm, but carrying a strength that made everyone in the room lean forward slightly. "I think you just answered your own question about why your own constituents rejected you so decisively." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Cheney's confident expression faltered for just a moment, but Boebert was just getting started. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the floor, the sound seeming to echo in the silent room. Every eye was on her now, and she commanded the space with a presence that came from authenticity rather than privilege. "You want to talk about qualifications?" she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Let's talk about qualifications. Let's talk about what actually qualifies someone to represent the American people in this chamber. Let's talk about what matters more, degrees on a wall, or understanding in your heart what it means to struggle, to work, to fight for every opportunity you get." She walked around the table, not approaching Cheney directly, but commanding the room's attention with every step. Her movement was purposeful, controlled, and absolutely compelling. This wasn't theatrics. This was raw, authentic power. "I earned my GED while working 3 jobs to support my family," she said, her voice carrying the weight of lived experience. "I didn't have the luxury of going to college right after high school because I had responsibilities. I had a family to feed, bills to pay, a life to build from nothing. I started a restaurant from the ground up and built it into a successful business that employed dozens of people in my community. I met payroll every month, not because I had trust fund money to fall back on, but because I understood that real people depended on me." The reference to Cheney's privileged background hit the room like a physical blow. Several members glanced at each other, recognizing the truth in Boebert's words. Cheney's face flushed red, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "I dealt with regulations that strangled small businesses," Boebert continued, her voice rising with passion. "I navigated tax codes that seemed designed to punish success. I fought through bureaucracy that made it harder for ordinary Americans to build something meaningful. I lived the challenges that millions of Americans face every day, while you were learning about them in theoretical discussions in Washington conference rooms. She paused, letting her words sink in, her gaze sweeping across the room before settling back on Cheney. I represented real, working people before I ever came to Washington. People who get their hands dirty, who work double shifts, who struggle to pay their bills while politicians like you tell them they don't understand what's best for them. People who don't have political dynasties or family connections to open doors for them. People who believe in the American dream because they've lived it, not because they've studied it. The room was completely captivated now. This wasn't just a political argument anymore. This was a fundamental clash between two different visions of what America should be, two different ideas about who deserved to have a voice in the halls of power. But Boebert was just getting started. She reached into her folder and pulled out a document, holding it up for everyone to see. The gesture was theatrical, yes, but it was also devastatingly effective. But you want to know what really qualifies someone to be in Congress, Liz? You want to know what gives someone the right to sit in these chambers and make decisions that affect millions of Americans? Being chosen by the people, being trusted by the voters, being accountable to the constituents who sent you here to represent their interests, not your own. She unfolded the paper slowly, deliberately, building the tension in the room. This is the Wyoming Republican primary results from August 2022. Would you like me to read them out loud for everyone here? Or would you prefer to do it yourself? Cheney's face went pale. She knew exactly what was on that paper, and she knew what was coming next. The confident mask she had worn throughout the meeting was beginning to slip, revealing something much more vulnerable underneath. Harriet Hageman received 113,025 votes, Boebert read clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. Liz Cheney received 55,108 votes. That's a 37-point defeat, Liz. 37 points. The people of Wyoming, your own constituents, the voters who knew you best, rejected you by the largest margin in Wyoming political history. The silence in the room was deafening. Some members were staring at the table, others watching the confrontation with fascination and horror. This was political theater at its most brutal and effective. They didn't reject you because of your education, Boebert continued, her voice growing more powerful with each word. They didn't reject you because you weren't smart enough or qualified enough. They rejected you because you forgot who you worked for. They rejected you because you spent more time on CNN than you did in Wyoming. They rejected you because you betrayed the people who trusted you with their votes and their hopes for representation. She walked closer to Cheney now, her voice taking on a more personal tone. You want to question my qualifications? Let's talk about the qualification that matters most in a democracy, the trust of the people. I have it. You lost it. I fought for it, earned it, and I protect it every single day. You took it for granted, abused it, and threw it away for the approval of people who will never vote for you. Cheney tried to interrupt, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. This is exactly what I'm talking about, Dash. No, Liz, Boebert said firmly, holding up her hand. You had your turn. You've had your turn for months, going on every liberal media outlet that would have you, trashing the very people who elected you. You've had your turn writing op-eds in the Washington Post, giving speeches to think tanks, appearing on book tours. Now it's my turn to speak, and you're going to listen. The authority in her voice was undeniable. This wasn't the same woman who had been sitting quietly at the beginning of the meeting. This was someone who had found her power and wasn't afraid to use it. Boebert pulled out another document, this one thicker than the first. This is your voting record from your last 2 years in Congress. Let me share some highlights with everyone here. You voted against the border wall funding that Wyoming voters supported by overwhelming margins. You voted against the energy independence policies that would have helped Wyoming's economy, would have created jobs for Wyoming families, would have made America less dependent on foreign oil. She flipped through the pages, her voice becoming more pointed with each revelation. You voted to impeach President Trump, the same president that Wyoming voters chose by 40 percentage points. You consistently opposed the America First agenda that your own constituents demanded. You prioritized the approval of Washington elites over the needs of Wyoming families. The indictment was devastating, and everyone in the room knew it. Cheney sat rigid in her chair, her face a mask of barely controlled fury, but she seemed incapable of mounting an effective defense. "This is what's wrong with Washington," Boebert continued, her voice now addressing the entire room. "This is what's wrong with our party. We have people who think they know better than the voters who sent them here. We have people who think their Ivy League degrees make them smarter than the working families who trusted them with their votes. We have people who believe that their connections and their family names give them the right to ignore the will of the people." She turned back to Cheney, her voice becoming more personal again. "You asked what qualifies someone with a GED to be in Congress. Let me tell you what qualifies me. I understand what it's like to struggle. I understand what it's like to work for every dollar, to worry about making ends meet, to lie awake at night wondering if you'll be able to provide for your family. I understand what it's like to build something from nothing, to create jobs, to take risks, to fail and get back up and try again." Her voice softened slightly, but the power remained. "I represent people who work with their hands, people who build things, who fix things, who make things that matter. People who don't have trust funds or political connections or family dynasties to fall back on when things get tough. People who believe in the American dream because they've lived it, not because they've studied it in some academic setting." She looked directly at Cheney, her eyes blazing with conviction. "You represent the Washington establishment. You represent the people who think they're too good for the rest of us. You represent the people who think education is about degrees on the wall instead of wisdom from experience. You represent the people who think that knowing the right people matters more than representing the right principles." Cheney finally found her voice, her anger overriding her political instincts. "This anti-intellectual populism is exactly what's destroying our party," she said, her voice shaking. "We need leaders who understand nuance, who can work with complex issues, who have the educational background to navigate the challenges of governing in the 21st century. We need people who understand that governing is more than just appealing to the lowest common denominator." The condescension in her voice was unmistakable, and it played directly into Boebert's hands. "Educational background," Boebert repeated, her voice now carrying a dangerous edge. "Let me tell you about educational background, Liz. I got my education in the real world. I learned economics by balancing a budget every month, by making payroll when times were tough, by understanding what it means when government regulations make it harder for small businesses to succeed." She began pacing now, her energy filling the room. "I learned foreign policy by watching my friends deploy to Afghanistan and Iraq, by seeing what happens when Washington politicians make decisions without understanding the consequences for the men and women who have to carry them out. I learned healthcare policy by trying to find affordable insurance for my employees, by seeing what happens when government interference makes healthcare more expensive and less accessible." She stopped directly in front of Cheney, her voice becoming more intense. "I learned about the Constitution by living under it, by seeing how it protects the rights of ordinary Americans, by understanding that it's not just an academic document, but a living guarantee of freedom. I learned about representation by actually representing people, not by studying theories about it in some ivory tower." The contrast she was drawing was stark and effective. "You learned politics at your father's dinner table, surrounded by Washington insiders who told you how the world works. You learned government in the halls of power, where decisions are made by people who never have to live with the consequences. You learned leadership by being handed positions you never earned, by having doors open for you that remain closed to everyone else." Her voice rose to a crescendo. "And look where it got you. Rejected by your own people, reduced to begging Democrats for relevance, spending your time on liberal media outlets attacking the very voters who once trusted you. That's the result of your superior education, Liz. That's what all those credentials got you." The room was completely silent now, everyone absorbed in the confrontation. This wasn't just political theater anymore. This was a fundamental reckoning with the nature of representation in American democracy. Cheney, realizing she was losing badly, played what she thought was her trump card. "At least I stood up to Trump when he was wrong," she said, her voice carrying a note of desperation. "At least I put principle over politics. At least I didn't bow down to populist pressure when I knew it was wrong for the country." Principle. Boebert's voice cut through the room like a knife. You call betraying the people who trusted you principle? You call working with Democrats to attack Republicans principle? You call spending millions of dollars of other people's money trying to destroy the political future of your own party members principle? She pulled out her phone and showed a photo to the room. "This is from your last campaign event in Wyoming. 13 people, Liz. 13 people showed up to support you in your own state. Meanwhile, Trump rallies in Wyoming drew thousands of people who stood in line for hours just to hear him speak. But you knew better than thousands of Wyoming voters, didn't you? You knew better than the people who had trusted you with their votes." The humiliation was complete, but Boebert wasn't finished. "You want to talk about principle? Let me tell you about principle. Principle is keeping your word to the people who elected you. Principle is fighting for your constituents, even when it's politically costly. Principle is understanding that in a democracy, the people's voice matters more than your personal opinion." She began addressing the room again, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had just definitively won a crucial battle. "This is the problem with our party. We have people who think they're above the voters, who think they're too smart, too educated, too sophisticated to listen to the people who elected them, who think their personal judgment is more important than the will of the people they're supposed to represent." She gestured toward Cheney, who sat rigid and silent. "Liz represents everything wrong with the Republican establishment. She thinks she knows better than the voters. She thinks she's smarter than the people who sent her here. She thinks her connections and her family name give her the right to ignore the will of the people who trusted her with their votes." Boebert pulled out another document, this one clearly prepared for maximum impact. "Let's talk about collaboration, Liz. This is a list of every Democrat who praised your work on the January 6 committee. Nancy Pelosi called you a person of great courage. Chuck Schumer said you were a true patriot. The New York Times wrote glowing editorials about your principled stand against extremism." She looked around the room, making eye contact with each member. When Democrats are praising a Republican, you have to ask yourself, who are they really serving? When CNN is giving a Republican primetime interviews every week, you have to wonder, what's the real agenda here? When the liberal media machine is promoting a Republican politician, what does that tell you about whose interests they're really representing? The implications were devastating. The Democrats used you, Liz. They used you to attack your own party, to divide Republicans, to weaken conservative opposition to their agenda. And when they were done with you, when you had served your purpose, they threw you away like yesterday's news. And now you're here, sitting in this room, trying to lecture the rest of us about loyalty and principle. Cheney's face had gone from red to pale, her composure completely shattered. The confident politician who had started this meeting was nowhere to be seen. In her place sat someone who looked defeated, diminished, and desperate. You want to know what really qualifies someone with a GED to be in Congress? Boebert continued, her voice now carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "I'll tell you what qualifies me. I understand what it's like to struggle. I understand what it's like to work for every dollar, to worry about paying bills, to lie awake at night wondering if you'll be able to provide for your family." Her voice became more passionate as she continued. "I represent people who work with their hands, people who build things, who fix things, who make things that matter to the real economy, people who don't have trust funds or political connections or family dynasties to fall back on when times get tough. People who believe in the American dream because they've lived it, not because they've studied it in some academic setting." She looked directly at Cheney again. "I represent people who get up every morning and go to work, not because they love their jobs, but because they have families to feed and bills to pay. People who understand that freedom isn't free, that prosperity isn't guaranteed, that the American dream requires hard work and sacrifice and determination. The room was completely captivated now. This wasn't just a political argument anymore. This was a fundamental statement about the nature of American democracy and who deserved to have a voice in it. You represent the Washington establishment, Boebert continued, her voice growing stronger. You represent the people who think they're too good for the rest of us. You represent the people who think education is about degrees on the wall instead of wisdom from experience. You represent the people who think that knowing the right people matters more than representing the right principles. She paused, letting her words sink in, before delivering what would be the final blow. But most importantly, Liz, you represent the past. You represent a Republican Party that took its voters for granted, that thought it could ignore the will of the people, that believed it knew better than the Americans who trusted it with their votes. I represent the future. I represent a party that listens to its voters, that fights for working families, that understands that in a democracy, the people's voice is the only voice that matters. Cheney made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. The people of Wyoming will realize their mistake, she said, her voice shaking. They'll see that experience and education matter. They'll see that governing requires more than just appealing to anger and resentment. They'll see that dash. No, Liz, Boebert interrupted, her voice cutting through Cheney's words with finality. They won't, because they didn't make a mistake. They made a choice. They chose authenticity over arrogance. They chose representation over condescension. They chose someone who would fight for them over someone who would lecture them about what they should think. She returned to her seat, but her presence still commanded the room. You want to know what really qualifies someone to be in Congress? Being willing to lose everything for the people who sent you here. Being willing to be attacked by the media, by the establishment, by people like you, because you refused to betray the trust that was placed in you. The room remained silent for a long moment, the weight of the confrontation settling over everyone present. Several members were nodding slightly, others staring at the table, processing what they had just witnessed. Cheney sat rigid, her face a mask of barely controlled fury and humiliation. Finally, Congressman Jim Jordan cleared his throat, breaking the silence. I think Lauren makes some valid points about representation and accountability, he said carefully, his words carrying more weight than their diplomatic tone suggested. Other members began to speak up, most supporting Boebert's position. The tide had turned completely, and everyone in the room knew it. This wasn't just about a personal conflict anymore. This was about the future direction of the Republican Party, and the choice had been made clear. Matt Gaetz leaned forward. I think we need to ask ourselves who we're really representing here, he said. Are we representing the people who elected us? Or are we representing the Washington establishment that profits from keeping things exactly as they are? The question hung in the air, and the answer was obvious to everyone present. The old Republican Party, the party of establishment figures like Liz Cheney, was dead. The new Republican Party, the party of authentic representation and working-class values, had been born in that room. Cheney tried to salvage something from the wreckage. This is exactly the kind of divisive rhetoric that's destroying our party, she said, her voice lacking its earlier confidence. We need unity, not these personal attacks. We need to focus on policy, not personality conflicts. Personal attacks. Boebert's voice was incredulous. You started this, Liz. You questioned my qualifications, my education, my right to be here. You made this personal when you decided to attack my background instead of addressing the issues that matter to American families. I just reminded you what the voters thought about your qualifications. She leaned forward slightly, her voice becoming more intense. The difference is, I accepted their judgment. I didn't spend months on television crying about it. I didn't try to blame everyone else for my failure. I didn't write books about how unfair it all was. I went back to work for the people who trusted me with their votes. The confrontation had revealed something deeper about the Republican Party's internal struggle. This wasn't just about Trump or policy differences. This was about class, about authenticity, about what it meant to represent the American people in the 21st century. Boebert stood up again, this time to leave, but her final words would echo in that room long after she was gone. "I came here to work for the people of Colorado's 3rd District," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. People who work hard, who love their country, who want their government to work for them instead of against them. People who understand that the American dream isn't a guarantee, but an opportunity that requires hard work and sacrifice. She looked around the room one final time, her gaze settling on each member present. "If that makes me unqualified in your eyes, Liz, then I'm proud to be unqualified. Because the alternative is becoming like you, out of touch, out of power, and out of excuses." As Boebert gathered her papers and headed for the door, Cheney made one final, desperate attempt to have the last word. "You'll regret this," she called out, her voice carrying a note of threat. "The party will regret this. The voters will regret this. History will judge all of us, and it won't be kind to those who chose populism over principle." Boebert paused at the door and turned back, her expression calm but determined. "The only thing I regret, Liz, is that it took this long for someone to say what everyone in this room is thinking. The only thing I regret is that the Republican Party wasted so much time trying to appease people who were never going to support us anyway." She opened the door and walked out, leaving behind a room full of stunned silence and one former congresswoman whose political relevance had just been definitively ended. The confrontation between Lauren Boebert and Liz Cheney represented more than just a personal conflict. It represented the fundamental choice facing the Republican Party and, by extension, American democracy itself. The age of the Republican establishment was over. The age of authentic representation had begun. And it had started with a restaurant owner with a GED who had the courage to stand up to a political dynasty and speak truth to power.